Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to see that everyone has a seat. Welcome. Trade. We're going to talk about trade. And before we start, I'm going to introduce this very distinguished panel. I can't tell you too many things about them because it'll take too much time. But let me just quickly introduce the panel and tell you a few things about each one of them. You probably know them all anyway. Mary Pangestu, who was an academic at ANU, by one way or another, eventually became trade minister in the early 2000s and minister of the Environment and Creative Industries. Tourism and Creative Industries. This was in this lasted from about 2004 to 2014, right? And now she's back where she was for many years at RSIS. Oh, you see, I'm really good at this. What I need to do is read my notes as I say these things. I'm terribly sorry. Right. Now, so that's
only knows what he's going to say about me.
That's mine. Now, Jesus Seade, Professor Jesus Seade, a distinguished academic. He's written lots of theoretical trade papers, with the emphasis on theoretical. But he's a very practical man because subsequently he went to work for the Mexican government and became the ambassador for Mexico to the World Trade Organization. Then he moved across to the World Trade Organization and was Deputy Director General in the very early years of the WTO from '95. And he was my boss for a while. He was okay as a boss. I can say that without sounding toady now, because he's not my boss anymore. And then he went to the IMF. He was there for some years. Then he moved over to this part of the world and was at Lingnan University for a decade, right? And now he's with the Chinese U in Shenzhen, the Shenzhen campus, where he's actually just moved recently. And you're all welcome to Shenzhen, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Jim Bacchus. Jim Bacchus has a long and distinguished career. He's now based in academia. Before that, he was doing law in a law firm. But before that, he was doing, I think, probably more interesting things than that. He was the head of the WTO appellate body, checking out cases and seeing what was wrong with cases and correcting the errors of the panels, which he, I think, enjoyed quite a lot. He was a member of the US Congress for 2 terms before he decided he'd had enough. He worked for the US government. So he's really a specialist in international law. Anything you want to know about international law, ask him. He will be able to tell you. So that's the panel. We have we can range far and wide, honestly, in this discussion. It's really up to you. But there were a few questions which at least I'll pose, and then I'll ask each one of the panelists to speak to that, and then we'll take it from there. One was, okay, we hear a lot of bad things about the way trade is going, the bad atmospherics, the Trump phenomenon, the obsession with bilateralism, the idea that a bilateral merchandise trade balance tells you all you need to know about whether or not your trading partners are playing fair or whether your predecessors were capable of negotiating a decent trade deal. And of course, it's monkey economics to suggest that you can tell very much at all that isn't to do with macroeconomic phenomena about bilateral balances on the current account. And anyway, it's only half the balance because he only talks about merchandise. But anyway, so that kind of thing, which is a really cramping any serious discussion of trade and where trade is going, is something that most of us are quite depressed about. Then you have the European mess, with Brexit and the huge uncertainties surrounding that. But you know, against all this, you heard Mike Spence this morning saying we've got this perfect situation of growth around the globe. trade growth projected for 2017 is 3.6%. It's been consistently upgraded. If it were to come out, if it comes in at 3.6%, it'll be the highest for a decade plus. So trade seems to be flourishing, but we worry awfully about trade policy and about trade politics. Now, how does all that sit together, and how should we think about that? Second thing is, we know that the WTO is battered, that in the 21st century, the WTO has done precious little by way of negotiating anything. The only things that have really been working are its acting as rule keeper and acting as an instrument for settling trade disputes. Aspects of its activities that can't go on indefinitely if it's lost its negotiating function. So we know the WTO is in trouble. Do we need it? Should we worry about it? And frankly, more broadly, if we're talking about trade cooperation, how much explicit cooperation do we need? Do we need cooperation on e-commerce, for example, or will it take care of itself? You know, the ways that we trade are changing rapidly. How much do we need a rule system? And if we need a rule system, what's wrong with what we've got? Why doesn't what we've got work, and how can it be made better? Is it to do with architecture, or is it to do with just politics? So some of those questions I invite you to consider, either individually or collectively, in terms of the different aspects of it, and then I think we can carry on a conversation from there. So, Mary, would you like to start? You don't have to. If you want to designate one of the others.
Okay, so how many minutes do you want us to kick off with? 5 minutes?
5 or 10, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, 5 or 10.
Yeah. Okay, welcome to the first non-manel panel for this.
I was going to say that. I was going to say that, and then I thought, well, I better not, overstep the mark and criticize too many.
But do people know what manel is? Yes, really, all the one who clapped knew. Man-only panel.
Yeah.
So we're going to write a note to Victor.
I think that would be a good idea.
That all of this morning, no women were on the panel, but I noticed that all the breakouts, they have at least one woman in each panel.
Well, that's a splendid concession, isn't it? Yes.
So that's a good way to start, right? So let me comment on kind of the three questions you posed. One was on kind of where is trade going. I think despite the pickup of trade in 2017, it would still come in as a one-to-one relationship, in the sense that 1% of GDP growth is leading to about 1% growth of trade, which is less than what was the case before the global financial crisis.
They're estimating 1.3, but you're still right, because it was double before.
Yeah. Yes, it was double before. So, I mean, the fact that trade is less of an engine of growth, I guess, which was also mentioned this morning, I think that's for developing countries, emerging countries who are kind of facing the middle income trap, what to do kind of question is an important development and strategic issue. The second thing on kind of the trade question is, of course, the retreat of the US and Europe on maintaining the world economic order. And I think what we have been discussing in many forums here in Asia is, what does that mean? Does that mean Asia needs to rise to the to step in? And obviously, President Xi's speech in Davos early in the year about China taking a role has been a lot of the discussion that has been happening. And I guess the other two issues, which again was mentioned this morning, was the whole narrative, anti-globalization narrative, which is putting a dampener on how countries are positioning themselves on trade policy. And of course, finally is the technological disruption. All these issues impact, I think, on trade and on trade policy. So if you ask the question, then what? What should be done? I would like to pick up on two issues that were raised this morning, or two statements that were raised this morning. I think Victor put it well. He said that we need to continue opening up. Despite all this, we need to continue opening up because otherwise we don't get growth, we don't get jobs, and we cannot address the development issues. And this was in contrast with one of the panelists who was saying, I think he was what was his name, Mark Levitt, I think his name? Yeah, he was saying something like, people have lost trust. Until we can get that trust back, let's put trade on hold. I'm paraphrasing. I don't think he exactly said that, but I don't think you can put trade on hold, because you need to grow. And, you know, you've got all these economic modeling exercises that actually show that if you put a stop to trade, the one that will be hurt the most is actually the poorest, the 10% poorest population. Even in the US, I think it was 60% of the poorest will be hurt if you actually put stop to trade. And if you increase reform, if you respond to protectionism by increasing protection yourself, then it's going to be lose-lose. World loses, you lose as a country. But if you even if you don't do anything, you'll still lose. The only way you're going to gain is if you and others like-minded, so regional agreements, continue to open up, then you'll have a positive benefit. So that's kind of the economics of it. But then how do we actually get momentum on openness and continued opening up? I think that's the big question. I'll try to answer on the multilateral side as well as the regional side, and then, of course, the other panelists can agree or disagree with me. I think the WTO, you said, do we still need the WTO? I still believe that we need the WTO. WTO is not just about negotiations, it is about the rules-based trading system, which will still have a vital importance, especially in light of what President Trump might do. I think we have, I keep on asking people, is President Trump's policies all bark and no bite, or are we going to see the bite soon? And one of the bites is actually that he wants to undertake unilateral actions, and that he's probably not going to pay attention to dispute settlement mechanisms through the WTO, and so on and so forth. That would be a dangerous and slippery slope to go down, and that would really affect the certainty of the rules-based trading system. So I think the WTO needs to continue to play that role. And to the extent that the WTO can still push negotiations, it's not going to be the big Doha Round. I think we don't even say Doha Round anymore, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't heard it recently, but we do see that WTO has achieved the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which has an impact on the way we do trade. It has tried to, and there will be things that only multilateral negotiations can achieve, like agriculture subsidies, like fisheries subsidies. Then you have what I think is Bernard Hoekman calls critical mass agreements. So you get a critical mass of countries, of members of the WTO, who agree to reduce restrictions on a particular sector, like what happened with the Information Technology Agreement and the, what's the other one? Environmental goods and services, and telecoms, yeah. So, and then it's done MFN. Critical mass of countries agree, but then it's given MFN. I think that's kind of the best, one of the best mechanisms. The other one is plurilateral, where a number of countries agree, but it's only for the preferences or the agreement is only for the countries who are in the agreement, like the government procurement and what they want the services one to be like. So these will be movements, but is it enough? For many countries, that's not enough, not fast enough, not addressing the new issues. That's why you have a proliferation of regional trade agreements. And I think Victor said that in Asia we are more optimistic. I think that was his word. And in developing countries, in emerging countries, in Asia, we are more optimistic. So I think there's actually more optimism on trade issues in Asia compared to other regions, because the major regional trade agreements are happening in Asia. You can count TPP 11. What is it called now? CTPP?
Yeah, the Canadians put something on.
Yeah, what's the C? Comprehensive. Yeah, but it's actually TPP 11. So I think the world...
Although it's less comprehensive and progressive.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, these are things that are involving Asian countries. So you've got TPP 11. So basically, I think, given the challenges, the world has kind of figured out how do we live with minus US world. I call it the G19 world. So we manage, I think the world has kind of figured out, okay, we still need to continue. Life goes on. Okay, US leaves climate change, but California continues to be in. TPP continues without the US, but we still have to engage with the US. We can't leave the US out, but we'll let Jim answer that one, how US can continue to be engaged. But we continue. And so TPP and RCEP is the other Asian one that's going on. TPP is more ambitious, less in terms of numbers of countries and size. RCEP is more. It has China, it has Japan. Neither now has the US. But RCEP is less ambitious. So which one is better? I think both are good in the sense that the issue about regional agreements is still the same. So when this session is titled New Playbook, right? I think the playbook on regional agreements is still the same. That is, you want regional agreements to be building blocks, not stumbling blocks towards greater multilateral opening up. What does that mean? It means it should have open regionalism characteristics, which means open accession. Right? And TPP finally, I think in the TPP 11 does have an accession clause, although I don't know how open it is. RCEP, I can say, has an open accession clause. Second, it should not have the spaghetti bowl effect, right? All the complicated regulations and rules of origins and so on that will make the cost of doing business really high and actually distort the global value chain that Victor was talking about this morning. So, yes, regional agreements can be the forces for opening up, the drivers for opening up. And we have been arguing in East Asia that it is the time for East Asia to rise and show and give a signal on greater opening up. And one should not, the final thing I would say is that one should not judge the agreements in Asia that usually compared to TPP, that they are low ambition, low standard, but you should look at it as a process. Mr. Ayala this morning, he also said that, well, people criticize ASEAN, it's slow, it's less ambitious. But you know what? Standards changed in the Philippines because it's a process. And there is a whole story behind how this part of the world, because of its international commitments, because of its regional commitments, it framed the unilateral reforms that actually is what matters and what pushes the continued process of opening up. So that's why we say the bicycle theory, Fred Bergston's bicycle theory of continuing to open up in any way, the alternative pathways, I think will come from the regional agreements, much less so from the bilateral agreements. And, well, I won't say anything about it, but I'll just highlight as the final point that all the talk about this morning about the issues on development and lack of distribution of benefits, they are very important, but you need to talk about complementary policies to address that.
Jesus.
Well, I don't disagree with anything that Mary said. Maybe some slight changes in emphasis, but very much I agree with everything she says. Of course, trade is growing. I believe trade is growing and things look positive, mainly for macroeconomic reasons. We had an absolutely gigantic disaster in the world in 2007, 2008, and everything that's happening in all this is the fact that we are still recovering, still coming out of that. Little to do with trade as such, any more than production as such or consumption of the world. So we are recovering from that, and things are going reasonably. Nevertheless, I do worry quite a lot about the drift away from multilateralism in all its forms that we are witnessing, be it Brexit, be it TPP failing in the shape it was being built, be it Trump's announced bilateralism or unilateralism. The world is going forward. Trade will continue to grow. Globalization will continue to grow. World value chains will continue to be more and more integrated, well, businesses will be more and more integrated. China will continue to grow. It's already the largest trading entity. It'll become even more so. It'll become the largest economy in the world sooner than later. But that does not mean that it just takes the place of the US and the US goes into a quiet retirement. Not at all. The US remains a formidably big, powerful economy. It will continue to be, for a huge horizon ahead, the largest seat of capital in the world. That means investment. It is the main base for technology, although China, of course, is catching up hugely, but a lot of technology. The largest military power. So it makes me uncomfortable to see a world increasingly integrated with two behemoths growing up there, where the fabric of multilateral rules that took pretty much a century to build is being just forgotten as something that, okay, maybe it was okay, but it's not really necessary. Trade is growing. Why is it necessary? I really think it is necessary, because it makes me nervous to see two big entities being prone to friction. Maybe one day there'll be a law passed in the US that makes it compulsory to apply monetary dumping measures. There's been a lot of talk about that for 20 years, 30 years. There was a lot of pressure to put into the Doha negotiations, not before anybody knew that they were going to fail, but there was a lot of pressure to put into those negotiations provisions that some countries have adopted in the protocols of accession that make it actionable to have an exchange rate that is outside the correct values, undervalued exchange rate, as if anybody could judge. Now, imagine if a country, US, for example, could take such action against China 10 years ago, 5 years ago, now. There could be a lot of blood on the floor. And it makes me nervous not to have a multilateral system that is not only strong, but respected and evolving, developing the rules that it should and not those that it should not. And for that, I think we definitely need the WTO. It makes me nervous, for example, also. I mean, I was here, Mary already mentioned Doha, but I was in a senior kind of small setting, high-level meeting on trade about 3 or 4 weeks ago in Hong Kong with, I think it was 12, 15 people, and not one, I chose not to speak until almost the end. It was like a breakfast, where everybody spoke whenever they wanted. Not one said a word about Doha. Whereas 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, all the rhetoric was Doha, Doha. How can we reinvigorate Doha? How can we complete it? And I always thought that was a terrible mistake. I personally am on record as having spoken against Doha long ago in the fora that Victor has held all along in Hong Kong the last very many years. I think Doha was not a well-conceived exercise. It was the caprice of negotiators in Geneva that wanted to have another exciting round. By the way, I was not the ambassador to the WTO. I was the ambassador creating the WTO, to the GATT that formed the WTO. In that capacity, I had a great pleasure of working with then Congressman Bacchus, as well as with distinguished trade advisor. You were an advisor to the government of Malaysia at that time, so I know all of them. And also Patrick, who at that time was advising Mexico, if I'm not mistaken.
Before you became my boss, yeah.
Yeah. Before I became your boss, because I brought you to Geneva, but you were in Mexico when I was ambassador. So anyway, we all have seen all these things in the past. And so all this ease with which we are saying, okay, the WTO is meaningless, it's not getting anywhere, can lead to a world without strong rules, where the rules are essentially centered on groups. RCEP, for example, that's China, with the countries it chose to bring into that negotiation. TPP, that I am personally not very sorry that it went out, was a great improvement in rules, a tremendously beautiful advancement in the technology of trade negotiations, but with a major flaw, which was ABC, anybody but China, in the negotiations. So all these different manifestations of a trend towards creating blocks and antagonistic blocks and jealousy or mistrust, taking the best of the business interest in working together, I think is worrisome. Now, what to do about that? Well, I think the solution was already mentioned by Mary. I really think that the WTO, as somebody said recently, if it didn't exist, it should be invented again. I think the WTO is certainly not perfect, whatever, but it is there, and it is the reference point that has to be used. What we need is continuing negotiations that are more realistic than what Doha tried to impose. Okay? The greatest achievement in the creation of WTO, you can ask anybody, and if that person is from Australia, he will say agricultural rules. And if that person is from Hong Kong or Japan, they will say improvement in anti-dumping rules. And if that person is from the United States, they will say improvement in access to agricultural markets in Asia. But the reality is that the main achievement of those negotiations was level playing field. It was a single undertaking. It was the fact that agriculture had no rules and came under default. Textiles had no rules and came under default. Developing countries had a blanket exemption from the rules and they came under default. So rules were created, and that was very good. And for that, you needed a single undertaking. But that medicine has become a bit of the poison, because you cannot continue to have negotiations going forward, call it Doha, where, I mean, it used to be the case that 10 countries defined a decision to be made in the pre-WTO days. The 4 or 5 biggest developed countries and the 3, 4 biggest developing countries. And then it got extended. Now you can't. Now you have 30, 40 countries that have to be convinced in order to go forward. You cannot have that. So the single undertaking is the problem. But why not go back to a technology that the world used before the WTO? There was something big and successful called the Tokyo Round of the 1970s, where the main achievements was the creation of a number, I think 11 or so, so-called Tokyo Round codes, which were agreements like the ones we still have, 1 or 2 of, on government procurement, on shipping building, on subsidies, on anti-dumping, agreements between groups of countries where certain provisions had to give to everybody, others were just among them, and that was the way to move forward. I think we need to go back to that. I don't think politicians will want to be in front and say Doha is dead, but they can say something close to that, like we'll modify Doha and allow countries to negotiate faster progress within particular areas. And what we need is a combination of those 2 elements. The critical mass agreements between countries that if they represent 95% of a sector, they can just do it and give to everybody else the opening. Or in other areas, the consent of others for a group of countries to make an agreement to make progress in some area. Because insisting on the single undertaking, insisting on the WTO moving forward is like insisting on relocating Australia 1,000 miles to the west. It's very difficult.
They wish.
It's very difficult.
Thank you. Jim.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. You could be learning more about AI. I should. But I told Patrick I'd be here. I agree with what my 2 friends have said in the entirety. Maybe I can follow up by adding a nuance or 2 and then trying somehow to explain what's happening in my country as it relates to trade in the WTO. When I was quite young, I was at USTR and involved in implementing the Tokyo Round codes. And Jesus is quite right. These were actually what we would call now plurilateral or coalitions of the willing kinds of agreements, or and as he mentioned in passing, but I want to underscore, these partial agreements among some contracting parties to the GATT almost all became fully multilateral agreements involving all the members of the WTO in the Uruguay round. I think they are and they can be the way to go. This was true of the Standards Code, which is now the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade. It was true of the Subsidies Code, which is now the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, and so on. Second point, I was in the Congress when we concluded the Uruguay round, and I was one of the people most involved in it in the Congress. I had the burden, since I'd been at USTR, of actually having read the GATT, which is certainly a political liability, but it enabled me to have influence beyond my seniority in what we did in trade. So we passed the Uruguay round implementing legislation in the United States. And a lot of us assumed that the Uruguay round would be the last round. A lot of us who formed the WTO, certainly in the United States, but I think in other places, assumed that there would never be another grand global round of the same kind that we'd had in decades past, that instead we had this new forum that would be an ongoing framework for trade negotiations of all kinds, involving coalitions of the willing, building critical masses, addressing different sectors, addressing different issues, concluding WTO plus kinds of commitments that would then apply to those who had signed them in the same way as the government procurement agreement, or to everyone where you truly had a critical mass, such as the information technology agreement. But we didn't think we'd end up in something like the Doha round. That really wasn't on our agenda. 9/11 happened, the Doha round got started. And I don't know quite who or how they decided that they were going to do it in the same way that they had done it before, but in retrospect, that was clearly a mistake. A lot of people assume that the Doha round is the only way that the WTO members are allowed to negotiate. That's not true. It's simply a choice that was made when the Doha round was constructed. There are other choices currently permitted in the WTO treaty, which is how we got the government procurement agreement and the information technology agreement, and how we hope to get an environmental goods agreement and a fisheries subsidies agreement. Cross our fingers. We could be doing that all the time, and I think we should be. When they first announced that they were going to proceed with this idea of a Trans-Pacific partnership, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal saying, well, this should have been done in the WTO. If it had been done in the WTO, it would have eliminated the geopolitical problem of some people thinking it was being done in order somehow to contain China. And even when they talk about now having an open agreement, it's open in the sense that if they all agree that they want you to get in, you can get in. Whereas with a plurilateral agreement under the WTO rules, there doesn't have to be a vote. If you're willing to be bound by the terms of the agreement, you automatically have the right to get in. No one took my advice. They rarely do. So here we are now, 16 years into the Doha round, and I think really the Doha round is over, trying to figure out how best to go forward, and doing so at a time when, lo and behold, Donald Trump is president of the United States. Now, there's one thing I would want my friends who are not Americans to know. 54% of us did not vote for that guy. He was duly elected as President of the United States, but only because we have an antiquated way of electing our presidents, something called the Electoral College that was invented in the late 18th century and probably wasn't a good idea even then. was a political compromise in order to hold off the commercial and populous might of the great Commonwealth of Virginia, then the largest state among the 13 original states. But the Electoral College still exists. I was among a group of members of Congress back in the early 90s proposing that it be abolished. They didn't take my advice. So I had the pleasure of being Al Gore's vice chairman in Florida in the year 2000, at a time when my law firm was representing George Bush in the legal proceedings in Tallahassee. All of which was in some ways tougher than being on the appellate body. Well, here we are now. Now, the good news with President Trump is, in terms of trade, he's mostly talked and tweeted. He hasn't done a lot yet. The things he has done have hurt the United States, but so far not really anyone else. We pulled out of the TPP. We pretty much abandoned the TTIP. We're demanding things in a NAFTA renegotiation that our trading partners simply cannot accept. Who knows what will happen with that? At the absolutely worst possible time, geopolitically, we've decided that the Koreans need to give us more under a free trade agreement because we have a bilateral trade imbalance, a deficit with them on goods, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the trade agreement, and so on. But so far, he hasn't done anything but tweet in terms of his promises of across-the-board tariff increases and barring all Chinese imports, et cetera. Watch what happens in the tax bill in the United States. I'm confident that the Republicans in the end will find a way to give tax cuts to rich people. But if they don't, the only thing that Donald Trump can do is turn to trade, to try to show that he can do something. He focuses on these 101 deals, bilateral deals, simply because he believes that that's where the United States can throw its weight around by negotiating from a stronger commercial point than its trading partners. I think they're a bit mistaken there. This is not 1972. But that's his view. Where has he done damage? He has done a lot of damage so far to the WTO, not in flaunting the rules yet in terms of taking unilateral trade actions, but at working inside Geneva to undermine the WTO dispute settlement system, which is the heart of the WTO. There's been very little publicity about this. The Economist did one little story. The Washington Post ran a column. Basically, it's been ignored. This is what we Americans would call inside baseball. But here's what they're doing. They're trying to intimidate the judges on the appellate body of the WTO. The United States has rightly told the world for generations now that the key to having the rule of law is to have an independent judiciary. And that means one that's independent of the government itself. Let me say that again. That means one that's independent of the government itself. This is true, as Carrie Lam said this morning, in Hong Kong. It's, I would say, true everywhere, including in Geneva. And in Geneva, we have 7 judges on the appellate body who have sworn to be independent and impartial in their judgments, and who are required, not once but twice in the WTO rules of conduct, to be independent and impartial. And this includes being independent of the members of the WTO themselves, including, I would say, especially that member of the WTO from whence they came. The way the appellate body works is this: once you cross the threshold of the appellate body, you shed your nationality. You work for everyone. I work for every member of the WTO equally by working for the system as a whole. That's the way appellate body members have done it now for more than 2 decades. That's been a key to the success of the system itself. It has created security, predictability, credibility, legitimacy for the dispute settlement system and thus for the WTO. The rules are applied to everyone equally, and everyone is equal before the law. Every country is treated the same. The United States wants to change that so that the United States will be, in effect, the judge in its own cases. It is threatening and has, didn't start with Trump. It started with Bush and then shamelessly it's continued and accelerated under Obama, for whom I voted twice. But now they've gotten truly serious about it in the Trump administration. They are trying to intimidate sitting judges by refusing to agree to appoint them to a second term unless they, in the view of the United States, have done as the United States wishes in their judgments in cases. And they've gone beyond trying to intimidate just the judges who happen to be Americans. Their theory is that the American judges should be doing what America wants, which is not how the appellate body works. Now they're intimidating the other judges. They've already succeeded in denying appointment to a judge from Korea. And they're refusing now even to engage in an appointment process until there is reform of the dispute settlement system. Other countries are asking, what do the Americans want? The Americans haven't said. What the Americans want is to be the judge in their own cases. What they want is for might to equal right in the WTO. This is not worthy of my country. I hope it will change, but in the meantime, the other members of the WTO need to stand up and somehow find a way to stop this. This is a stealth war against the WTO, but it's the real war that's being conducted against the WTO, not the one that involves just Trumpian bombast from day to day. This is the real conflict. The United States is winning this conflict, and there's no sign of sufficient pushback from the other countries to keep the United States from continuing to win. This must change. If the appellate body's independence is undermined, then its integrity, its credibility, and its legitimacy is undermined as well. The appellate body is the glue that holds the entire WTO dispute settlement system together. If we undermine the appellate body, then we undermine the entirety of the dispute settlement system. The WTO dispute settlement system, along with the rules themselves that are upheld in the system, is all that's keeping the WTO going. So if we undermine the dispute settlement system, then we undermine the entirety of the WTO. These are the stakes. We need to stand up for the international rule of law in trade, and in so doing, we'll also be standing up for the international rule of law itself in every human endeavor. Hope we have time for questions.
Yeah, just a quick observation before we throw it open. On the first question, I think Jesus has nailed it. The reason we're looking at these healthy trade figures is essentially cyclical. The structural damage that might be wrought on the system will take more time to work through, so we shouldn't be complacent about great trade growth. There's significant downside risks. The panelists pretty like-minded, actually, as all bad, I mean, good panels, no, well, whichever way you like to look at it, about the necessity of the multilateral trading system. They may put different emphasis on parts of it. But the one thing I just want to also raise here, which has been it's been in the discussion, but China has risen remarkably rapidly in terms of time. If you look at GDP, trade shares, especially since 2000, it's been a very rapid process. these kinds of shifts in the center of economic gravity, historically, historians would say, can often lead to conflict. I mean, real conflict. Okay. We're trying to do this without conflict. But the fact is, at the heart of all these difficulties is this rivalrous relationship between the United States and China. And I don't think it matters whether you're talking about the WTO or you're talking about preferential trade agreements. The same thing is prevailing. And so the question really is, what can you do about that? So I don't think any of you have really answered that, but we will throw it open. Maybe we'll get an answer from the floor. And the third is the systemic question. And I would part company a little bit from Jesus on the question of what the Uruguay Round brought us. I think the Uruguay Round brought us conflict that hadn't existed in such intensity before between developed and developing countries, because many developing countries felt that things were being shoved down their throat. They didn't know what they were signing. They were being asked to sign things that worked for those who were able to implement them and who really in whose interests they were. One of the solutions that some of you have suggested is to do this, some call it critical mass, and call it move like-minded countries getting together, these plurilaterals. But there's a core here which has to be thought about in terms of WTO. Are these things discriminatory or not? If you do the ITA or you do the telecoms agreement, they don't discriminate, they don't change the balance of rights and obligations in a way that affects the rights of those who don't sign. They're the increase of rights for those who do sign, but those who don't will enjoy whatever the benefits are to be had from it. If you sign the government procurement agreement, and some people are suggesting that that's the model, it's very different because you discriminate against those who don't sign. So you fracture the system in a way that so far hasn't really happened, at least in a legal sense. And so my question is, which kind of agreements are we talking about, and how do you get the dynamic to make those work? But I'm not going to ask you these questions now because I really think we should bring the floor in. But I think those are things that I take from the discussion so far, particular points that maybe we could return to. But over to you, please. Yeah, please go ahead.
If you would identify yourself, it would help us, I think.
Sorry. Somin Mary, I'm a non-resident fellow of Google, but I live in India and work in India. My question to Marie really was, you seem to be suggesting that regionals were a way out to keep moving, as per your bicycle theory on this. And being one of the few people here from India, India's difficulty, particularly with RCEP, has essentially been about the unwillingness of other partners to engage on services. Firstly, is that right? And B, given that we use the language of high quality, aren't services high quality? So can you, as a policymaker from ASEAN, speak a little bit about the political economy of services liberalization in Asia? And if there's anybody on the panel who has a view on, well, the impact of Brexit, and more broadly, I mean, will the impasse between Britain and the EU result in either side, in a sense, resorting to WTO, MFN as the kind of default? Because we've come to the conclusion, partly because of Doha, as I understand it, I'm not a trade specialist, that basically regionals and super regionals were the way out because of impatience with what was going on in Geneva. But given where we are now with TPP, with TPIP, with Brexit, I mean, is this a reason for people to return to Geneva? Two quite different questions. And you may want to take others before.
Yeah, let's do a couple more. Yeah.
Simon Cox from The Economist. First, simple question. Is China a market economy? Second, there's now a bipartisan consensus, I think, that in America, that China doesn't play fair on trade. Are any of the complaints legitimate, and if so, what would be the best example? And then a couple of you mentioned the founding of the WTO. And do you think it was assumed at the founding of the WTO that all of its members would be or soon become market economies? Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Vincent. I'm from Hong Kong View.
Can you speak up? Sorry.
Yes, I have two big questions. One is the competing trading blocks. How would that impact future trading relations in East Asia? We have China and Japan. Like, they're all competing for the best trade relations, so how would that shape future trading landscape? And second is the bilateral trade negotiation that Trump preferred, because U.S. has the advantage, right? But the other countries, they're not stupid, right? They know they'll be at a disadvantage. So how likely would those countries be willing to be put in such a disadvantageous situation, and how likely would that lead to more actual trade conflict or trade war? Thank you.
Murray, would you like to answer the question that was directed explicitly at you first?
Yes. Yes, on the RCEP, is this on?
Yeah.
On the RCEP negotiations, with respect to India, India wants this high ambition for services, but it gives a very, very low ambition on goods. That's part of the conflict. And for a long time, India wouldn't even put anything on the table in the RCEP negotiations, only until I think I think we're on the 18th round or something like that. I think it's 17 or 18, lost count. So only the 2 rounds ago did they actually come up with their offer for the goods, and that has been slowing down the process. Whereas the idea of RCEP is actually that you're consolidating 6 free trade agreements that existed between ASEAN and all these dialogue partners. And the idea is that you should go towards the best. Out of the 6, you go to the best. So in other words, in goods, it should be 99%, which is what we have coverage, which we have with New Zealand and Australia. And India is the lowest at 80%. And we were going this way instead of this way. And then in services, we were going like this, whereas in services sector for ASEAN is still a relatively sensitive sector, as well as for the other countries. So I think the gaps are coming down, but they didn't, as I had hoped, completed the RCEP negotiations at the just last week summit of the ASEAN summit. It didn't happen, but there was a call again to complete negotiations by next year, right? So I think there has to be movement. There has to be flexibility from all. By the way, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan also are up here. The ambition is up here. And then ASEAN is in the middle, actually. So it should go towards more the kind of the middle ground, if you like. Because I think you should, as I said earlier, RCEP is a process. You may come with a lower ambition than what you thought, but it's a process. It will ratchet up. It will get more ambitious. This has been the experience of ASEAN. And I do believe that the other problems that why RCEP has issues is the issue between India and China and between China and Japan, who don't have FTAs, right? All the others, like the 10 with the 6, we all have FTAs. But then between the 6, you have issues also with the FTAs.
We'll come back to the Brexit question. Just want to ask Mary one other question, then is China a market economy?
I think all countries still have issues with that question, and it is about transparency. It is about how much is there really market prices? How much is there still subsidies embedded? I think these are all still questions out there, and you do have to be a market economy, I think, to be a full member of the WTO, in the sense that all the remedy measures and all the issues all the rules that apply on the WTO. So I think China has gone a long way. If you look at from where it came from before it was a member of WTO to now, but I think there are still questions of transparency, especially I think with the role of state-owned enterprises, with the role of some of the pricings that we see in China, and technology issues, which are all we know about. So I think until there's greater transparency and the reforms that people wish to see, it will probably still not qualify as a market economy.
Okay, Jim.
I'm going to allow my successors on the appellate body to judge the market economy status case, but let me say this about that issue. It is widely assumed that whenever that case reaches the appellate body and there is a judgment, then that judgment will apply for all time and for all purposes. That's a mistaken assumption. The appellate body will be looking at a specific dispute that is before it on the basis of the facts that have been found by the panel before the appeal reaches the appellate body. The appellate body will judge on that basis and on that basis alone. The appellate body ruling may have a broad scope, but it may have a much narrower scope. And on this question, there are endless nuances that could need to be explored in future disputes. Let me see if I can be more helpful on your other question. If I may step back a minute in terms of the disputes that are at this point outstanding or contemplated or anticipated between the United States and China. China has quite a few good cases against the United States, especially on the continuing refusal of the United States for some inexplicable reason to comply with WTO rules on trade remedies. This has been the source of most of the U.S. losses in WTO dispute settlement that President Trump has been complaining about. All of these losses could have been avoided had the United States simply been willing to comply with the WTO rules on which they agreed, and in many instances on which the United States itself insisted on in the Uruguay round. In turn, the United States, I think, has a number of solid cases against China under current WTO rules if the United States chooses to bring those cases. I would say there is a potentially very strong case that China is systematically not enforcing intellectual property rights in the ways in which it is obliged to do so in the TRIPS agreement. There are other instances. It is not surprising that two of the leading trading nations in the world would have trade disputes. I do not see this as a harbinger of anything dire in world affairs. This is simply commerce, and it should be treated as simply commerce. We need to recall why we invented the trading system in the first place. Yes, we wanted to lower barriers to trade, but also we wanted to make certain that the protectionist measures that were taken in the 1930s that led to World War II would not be taken anew and lead to World War III. The fact that we have not had a third World War is, I would say, one sign of the success thus far in the past 70 years of the world trading system. I shouldn't have to state these things, but there they are, and we tend to forget this. It is only natural that trading countries would have disputes, and it is required in the WTO treaty that where those disputes fall within the scope of the treaty, they must be taken to the WTO. If the United States ignores that obligation, then that in itself will be a violation of the WTO treaty. That's a ruling in one of our cases while I was there. I can't remember which one. Someone in the audience will doubtless know. Where are we now? We have a number of rules in the WTO treaty that can be used to resolve disputes. And we also have a number of needs for the resolution of disputes that right now do not find reflection in the WTO treaty in the form of rules. The Trump administration has said that the WTO is as much as useless because it can't resolve these disputes. First, I would say the United States needs to use the WTO rules that we already have. An example is in intellectual property. But there are other examples where there are cases waiting to be brought under the current rules that could and should be brought in the WTO dispute settlement system and could be resolved there. Where there are not rules, we should be negotiating the rules we need. Electronic commerce, I think, is one example. But we are not doing that. Instead, we're off on this other tangent in the United States, which I think leads us down the very wrong road.
We've got only 15 minutes left, I understand. So let's try and...
There's a question that I think was raised, let me take it up, on the conflict between regional agreements developing and WTO. Are those alternative courses? I would say the answer is yes and no. The reason, the whole WTO, as Jim Bacchus just said, the whole thing comes from the 1930s and the evil use of trade discrimination for countries to antagonize each other and the consequences we all had. So the key concept of the multilateral trading system since its creation, GATT 1948, is non-discrimination. So that's the key concept. From the beginning, one major form of exception was created. There was another one for developing countries that subsequently was basically eliminated. But there's one key concept, one key avenue for discrimination that was enshrined in the rules from the beginning, given its own rule, which is discrimination for the purpose of creating an economic union, a free trade area, a common trade area. Now, the purpose in creating all that from the beginning had a name, and the name was European Communities. Okay? It was to allow the Europeans that had essentially 3 world wars. I mean, if you count the Franco-Prussian War in the 19th century, which is very much a world war without the United States, so it wasn't called World War, it was terrible. So they had 100 years of wars, and very much with economic factors igniting them. And so the whole purpose of having the discrimination to allow for economic union, for free trade areas, was to allow the Europeans to create a free trade area. That's free trade among neighbors. So it's a very good example of a free trade area that should have been created and was created. Another good example is NAFTA. Now, there's a lot of trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. A lot. There's always been. So it is a logical agreement to have that it seems not to be in serious peril. But that's what was intended from the beginning. And you have others. You have countries in South America, for example, the neighbors in Mercosur, or in old days, Colombia and Venezuela, or you have which other free trade areas have been naturally successful?
Pacific Alliance.
We should
yeah, exactly. Well, ASEAN is an excellent example. Yeah. What worries me is that without reaching the rules as such, the politics has gone into it in a big way. ASEAN is one thing, NAFTA is one thing, but having something like TPP with the United States and all the Pacific, basically, minus China, intention or no intention, I think is unwise. I think is not what was intended, and is not what should be intended. If you're going to have a negotiation that big, then as Jim Bacchus himself wrote, as he told us, well, they should be negotiating in the WTO. That's big enough to create momentum for a global negotiation. So why not go for it? Bring the Europeans in who wanted to be in that, and that's why they were given the TPIP as a parallel negotiation. So it was the US negotiating big with Europe and negotiating big across the Pacific. That could have been made into a collective exercise and force China in, force politically, and you would have a real big negotiation on the way. Instead of that, we go for these mega free trade areas that I think distort the world order. The most important thing is having a fabric that relates China, United States, and Europe. And anything that goes against that, I think, is a bad idea, consistent or inconsistent with the rules of the WTO. So it's not a question of trade technicalities, it's a question of political misuse of the instrument.
Okay, thanks. I know a couple of questions haven't been answered. Simon, there was definitely a different expectation when China joined the GATT, the WTO. There was clearly a different expectation of the trajectory it would take, but it's about very much glass houses and who throws the stones, I think, would be the answer to your other questions. As far as the question about will the bilaterals work, I would say you're absolutely right. It's not going to, it's just because one country's immensely more powerful, there are other factors at work. So I think you're right about that. Let's just take a couple more questions, but we're going to have to answer them rapidly because we're going to run out of time in 7 minutes.
Thanks, Patrick. Enda from Bloomberg News. A brief one to you, Mr. Bacchus, maybe. On the US IP probe against China, we don't know the details, etc. In broad terms, how likely is it that they can prosecute a case there that China has been involved in?
Before you start, Larry?
I'm Larry Lau from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I just want to raise one issue. If you really think about today, the solution with globalization, economic globalization, actually is not so much due to the fact that trade has really grown and benefited a lot of people. It's really because within each country, globalization has created both winners and losers in every country. Yeah. Right? And you know, even though each country benefited on the whole, but within each country, you know, there are winners and losers. And I think the market system has not compensated the losers. So you look at the United States, for 20 plus years, people haven't had any, you know, many people have not had any improvement. And look at Europe, you know, at UK, I mean, all these populist votes, they are really voting against the concept that they haven't benefited all these years, right? And I don't think any further expansion of these trade rules have worked, but I don't think we solve the problem of the dissolution and dissatisfaction of the common people in not having benefits.
None of us has said it would.
Okay, hang on. Before we go there, can you just answer the other question?
Yes. We have limited time. I took a stab at answering your question in an opinion piece I did for some publication called the Wall Street Journal a month or two ago. I believe it's on the AGI website right now. So you can look at that for the specifics, so I won't bog anybody down here. Your question, are they going to take such a case? I've seen no evidence that they will. This is one of the things that frustrates me about what's happening in U.S. trade policy. They're not using legitimate tools in a legitimate way. When doing so, could produce a real result. The Chinese have a very good record of complying with WTO rulings when they have been judged to be acting inconsistently with their WTO obligations. Okay. Why not take them to court again?
You've got 6 minutes, 2 minutes each, just to wind up, including if you can take in Larry's question, that would be great. Mary.
Yeah, I think I would just emphasize what Jim just said. I believe that in all this increased protectionism, if you look at the numbers, actually, yes, there's increase, but most of them are trade remedies using standards and TBT. So it's all within the WTO rules. And that's what we should be using to make sure that, okay, there will be increase, but as long as they still can be resolved under the WTO rules, and if there's any dispute, it can be resolved by the dispute settlement mechanism. That is really what is going to be, whatever happens, it should be really the vital structure of the world trading system. So again, emphasizing what Jim was saying earlier, that there has to be a fight back on this, what is happening with the U.S. To answer Larry's question, of course, yes, we mentioned it, but we didn't talk about it in depth. But of course, every country will have a different source of why the inequality and the lack of distribution happens, and therefore a different set of policy responses nationally. But if you talk about the international cooperation angle, then trade agreements, I have always been an advocate of building in capacity building within the trade agreements, which is why all the agreements in Asia have this component called capacity building, and TPP actually has 3 chapters. Supposedly on it. Yeah, so it's increasingly, but it's got to be real, and it's got to really benefit the inequality. And I was just reading that there's even a gender, did you know there was a gender-based article in the Chile, Canada, and the Chile-Uruguay round agreements, yeah. So there's even for inclusiveness, yeah? You have a gender-based, i.e. if you have to change your regulation so it doesn't discriminate against gender. So I think these are the issues that we have to face, and each country will have different answers nationally, but let's not forget the international cooperation angle. And finally, the technology is the answer to greater inclusiveness in the future.
Let me just say, echo more than answer the point made by Larry. I really think that the scourge of our age, the economic problem of our age, is not trade friction or trade disputes. It's income concentration. It's a massive income concentration. And why is that happening? People blame globalization as if it means open trade. I do think it is globalization, but it's not open trade. It is the direction capitalism is taking. We have cheaper transportation, cheaper transfer of information, cheaper everything. That makes the world more a single village in the competitive sense. So if you are very good at doing what you do, and you're in California, you may take over the whole world and create a big quasi-monopoly there, or from China or from India. So there's more and more concentration of markets, more and more concentration of returns to the people who own those sectors, to the people who design those goodies, to the people who are the top engineers working there. When I was a student, being an engineer was a good way to have a good living. Now you have to be a brilliant engineer, not just an engineer. So there's more and more income concentration. Now, open trade aggravates this. It allows the violence of capitalism to sweep the world. Of course, there has to be much and more and more attention to these problems in the future, with or without open trade. Open trade is good, but we need to take seriously these problems. Yeah.
Amen. You've got 1 minute if you wish, or you can forego it.
Well, I just want to thank AGI for inviting me again. I've been in this room before, and I'm happy to be here now. I appreciate the opportunity always to pontificate.
Great. So an incomplete discussion, I'm afraid, in the hour and a quarter we had, but thank you very much for your participation and for attending, and thank you very much to the panelists.